This has been a recurring theme throughout the history of the SSI, and it's based on a fundamental premise, and it is that the normative framework for outer space activities is outdated and insufficient. What is called the cornerstone of the space security regulatory framework or legal framework is over 40 years old. It's the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And it does not account for the rapidity, the sheer speed with which space applications have advanced in recent years. In other words, not only is there a gap between current reality of space activities and the normative framework, but in fact the gap is growing wider and wider by the year as more spacefaring actors enter the space domain, as the barriers to entry decrease, as the domain becomes more crowded, as you have beyond military, commercial, and civil interests, etc. So that underscores the necessity for the international community to build a robust normative framework. So in this sense, we see basically two competing approaches. On the one hand, you have national versus multilateral efforts to develop a robust framework for outer space activity. On the other hand, you have legally binding versus non-binding approaches to regulate the space domain. Now, I should clarify, these need not be mutually exclusive. In other words, there may be some degree of complementarity between these approaches. I mean, a national effort in the way of a pledge or a paper outlining policy on space activities may contribute to the development and to multilateral dialogues that will develop at forums such as UN bodies, robust multilateral policy instruments. On the other hand, likewise, legally binding and non-binding approaches need not be mutually exclusive. In other words, one may lead to the other, or one may occur concurrently with the other. A space security regime does not necessarily entail a single space security policy instrument. Although this is sometimes what this sort of discussion evokes in certain groups, in certain sectors. And then they are pitted against each other, so they say it's either this one or this one. It's either the non-binding approach or this draft treaty proposal that is legally binding, when in reality one may be built toward the other. So the question is status quo or immediate prohibition. And the way I framed it like this is because states have become, especially those that have been active in space for a long time, have become quite reluctant to see their ability to operate freely in space curtailed. So they're weary of measures to curtail their ability to operate freely. But the question does not necessarily have to be immediate prohibition of certain space activities. I mean, there is such a thing as transparency and confidence building measures that, pending a more robust space security framework, normative framework, can serve as important middle grounds. So you have, for example, a voluntary moratorium on certain conducts, like the use of anti-satellite weapons. Even before they are regulated, you can tell the international community, I will refrain from using them because I recognize that they pose an indiscriminate threat. Or you can engage in data sharing, I mean, non-sensitive information about positional information of satellites or launch data, etc., as this will arguably foster an environment that will be conducive to developing more concrete policy instruments. There is also the question of what is the appropriate forum for discussing these issues. On the PowerPoint, on the slide, you see a couple of short paragraphs from the draft final document of the 2011 COPUOS plenary session this past June. And it's just to highlight the contrast and the divergence of views that you find in this forum. Number 24 says that the view was expressed that the conclusion of the PPWT, which is a legally binding treaty by Russia and China that aims to prevent the placement of weapons in outer space, that it would prevent an arms race in outer space. In other words, item 24 is endorsing, in a way, this treaty. Immediately after, Another delegation expressed a completely different view, saying that this was not I'm talking about COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, that this was not the ideal forum to address weapons matters, because COPUS is should be more intended towards technical matters and peaceful uses. And the obvious place would be the CD, but as many of you are aware of, the CD has been deadlocked for several years. So it leaves sort of discussion of space security issues in the limbo, because it's thrown out of COPUS, but the CD is dysfunctional. There are, to be sure, specific proposals on the table for consideration. On the one hand, we have the Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities, which is being proposed by the